Hello, everyone. Today we'll begin talking about Peter Roose's conception of the nature of science, and especially how the nature of science fits with or fails to fit with religious views. And Roos really hasn't as a target Christianity. If you look at his own history, chapter 1, he was brought up in a fundamentalist Christian household, and it's really he's responding against, he's rejecting that tradition that he was brought up in. He's also responding to Peterson. Peterson is a contemporary Christian. He's a philosopher, he's a scientist, and he's a believer. He's a Christian. So Roos has in mind not just religion in general, like he's not really after like Hinduism or Buddhism. He really has in mind Christianity, the more distinctively Christian views or beliefs about the world, and the way in which those fit with or fail to fit with science. So let us begin. Great book. I highly encourage you. We're not going to be reading the entire book, but I highly encourage you to keep it and read it as when you have the time. It's a great book to be in your bookshelf. So Roos begins by talking about science or thinking about science. And the first few things he tells us are kind of not very controversial. They're kind of relatively straightforward. They're probably the kind of thing you heard in other undergraduate courses or even high school. So what is science? Well, here's what what Roos has to say. Rushing in as a fool where angels fear to tread, let me follow the great English philosopher John Locke and say that science is an attempt to understand the world of experience, meaning now the world of the senses and also the world within us of sentience. So he uses sentience to mean something like mind, though he doesn't like the word mind. Roos doesn't, because this sounds too much like non-physical thing that is beyond the reach of scientific inquiry, and he doesn't like that. He thinks like, oh, that sounds like spirit, the soul, or God-like thing, and like he's an atheist, right? He thinks there are no such things. So he thinks the word sentience, the ability to feel, is a more scientifically amenable term to describe our experiences as agents in the world. So he includes that sentience as the possible object of scientific inquiry, though as we'll see later on, he thinks ultimately that that's beyond the reach of science. Science cannot tell us. It's beyond its domain, beyond its kind of proper application, what we are as thinkers, as minds that cannot be known by science. Roos is going to claim. But other parts of this quote matter, right? They're the science is an attempt to understand the world of experience, that which is given to us by the senses. So at the heart of science is something like empiricism. The senses are the ultimate court of appeal when it comes to knowing reality. What kind of reality? The reality delivered to us by the senses. That's a starting point, and that's the final kind of goal of scientific inquiry, to make sense of the thing that is given to us by the senses. That's a proper domain of application of scientific investigations. Here's another piece that doesn't quite fit so well with what he just said, but it's also clearly part of what science is. So science is about finding out the laws of nature, the universal rules that apply to or make sense of, make regular the other facts in the world. So science is about finding the causes that explain in the kind of universal sense why things are the way they are. So he's thinking mostly like Newtonian mechanics, right? Those kinds of laws of motion, gravitational laws and things like that. Those are the kinds of universal claims about the world that systematically describe the behavior of matter. That's the real subject matter of science. That explains the world of experience, claims Roos. Roos continues, somehow we want to go beyond just describing things to saying why things work. So science is not just about categorizing or cataloging things into different categories, merely describing things, but rather it's about saying or identifying kind of why things work. And putting it that way matters a lot for Roos, why things work, and we'll see why shortly. Science is about doing that, identifying the mechanisms whereby things do what they do. Um, Ultimately, science aims to build a universal system or model or the picture or theory, which includes all laws of nature and causes, and thus explains why the world of experience is the way it is. So the point of science is to look at, to try to identify the causes in the physical world, the world given to us by the senses, in such a way that there's this systematic, unified description of the whole, partly grounded in the laws that govern the whole. What is the whole? The world given by the senses. That is science. Insofar, it should seem very familiar, right? Nothing earth-shattering so far. But here is the more distinctive claims that Roos makes about science. So there is some major debate amongst philosophers of science or scientists sometimes, but mostly philosophers of science. And it's a debate about realism versus anti-realism in science. The realist, like Peterson, think that science is ultimately an attempt to describe objective reality, reality as it is. A scientific theory is true if and only if it describes the world, it captures or represents the world the way the world is. So science is an objectivist enterprise. The point of science is to figure out what reality is like. That's the realist position. The anti-realist position, like Roos's position, is harder to describe, but it's one that gives up on the idea that we can ultimately know the way reality is. The anti-realist thinks that in some sense we're necessarily trapped in our own perspectives, that we're necessarily trapped in our own cultural preconditions, cultural assumptions, and that science just is kind of a manifestation of those cultural assumptions. And here's the way in which Roos plays out the anti-realism part. He claims, whereas I see science as a human construct, something we do, with its feet in the culture of the day. Science is an activity that humans engage in that doesn't kind of actually get to reality as it is, and that is colored by or influenced by the culture, the assumptions, the questions, the ideas that we as scientists bring to the activities that is science. He, and pointing to Peterson, sees science more as a disinterested reflection of objective reality. Peterson thinks that the point of science is precisely to do away with, to undermine or kind of go beyond the prejudices, the cultural assumptions, the particularity of our perspectives, and find a way of describing the world as it is in itself. Not merely as it appears to us. As it appears to us can, be how it is or not how it is. And one of the great beauties of science, claims Peterson, is that it enables us to have a description of the world that is accurate, that is true, that it corresponds to the way the world is. So it's not colored by, at least when science goes well, it's not colored by the assumptions, the cultural assumptions that we bring to the table. It's an attempt to describing the way the world is, science is, claims Peterson. And Roos is denying that. He thinks science cannot do that. And here, Roos continues. You don't do science just by putting on a white coat on Monday morning and walking into the lab and looking into the world. The looking into the world is the crucial part. Roos is pointing out that when a scientist is not doing sciencey things, they're human beings, right? They have assumptions. They're part of their culture. They're seeing the world through a particular angle and perspective with a lot of assumptions and biases and so on. And the one does not just abandon that by putting on a scientific kind of approach, a white coat, and then it disinterestedly looks at the way the world is. We cannot do that. We're always trapped in our perspectives, claims Roos. Furthermore, continues Roos, you have questions, you have problems, you have ideas, you have hypotheses. Your history as a person embedded in culture, that is what you bring to the table as a scientist. And science just is the kind of playing out of those assumptions, of those problems, of those ideas by doing experimentations and then forming hypotheses or theories vindicating those hypotheses or falsifying those hypotheses. on the basis of empirical investigations or experimentations. But that's all intertwined, inevitably intertwined with the cultural assumptions that you cannot escape, claims Roos. And here's a deep point that Roos makes a big deal out of. All observations are made in some context. They're made by humans that have assumptions and questions, and they're made by, a particular kind of cultural context. So the cultural context informs the very meaning or interpretation of the data, the result that comes from the scientific experiment. And Roos thinks that is inescapable, that colors and shapes all scientific theory. And we just cannot go to a point in which we just describe the way the world that it is, describe the way the world is. Peterson thinks we can. Here's a crucial part of Roos's position. The key to science is metaphorical thinking. We look at the world or its parts through the familiar lens of something with which, through the lens of something with which we are familiar. So to engage in metaphorical thinking is to bring a thought or an idea in a different context from which the idea originated, and use that idea as a way of illuminating the new context. And one of the examples that Roos uses is the metaphor of height, right? To say that someone is tall is just to say that has a longer height than someone else, right? I'm 6'2", and if you're 5'8", then I am taller than you. That's kind of the proper, straightforward, literal meaning of the word tall. But he points out that sometimes we say things like, no man stands as tall as when he kneels down to help a baby, or some quotes to that effect. And the point there is that even though we use the word tall, we're not really talking about height, right? Because the person is kneeling. So they're not standing tall in the literal meaning of the word tall. What Roos points out is that we're using metaphorical language that is appropriately applicable to heights, measurements, lengths. And we're doing that to ascribe, we're ascribing those ideas metaphorically to the moral domain. And when we say no man stands as tall as when he kneels down to help a child, what we mean is that his moral stature, his moral character is increased, is magnified, is shown to be greater by doing those acts of helping a child. It is helping the child that increases the moral virtue of the person who's helping the child. And that's the more literal thing that we're trying to say. But we use the metaphor of height to try to illustrate that. We say he stands tall when he kneels, right, to help a child. But we know what we mean, right? We know that we don't mean he measures longer when he's kneeling. Of course he doesn't, right? What we mean is that there is this other thing, namely morality, that is expanded, that is made greater by those kinds of acts. And there's no confusion, or we know what we're talking about. That's metaphorical language at work. And Roos thinks that metaphorical language is at work in science everywhere. At the root of science is using metaphors of things we are familiar with and projecting them or bringing them to a scientific context to try to illuminate the scientific inquiries or experiments or theories. And he thinks that there is a metaphor that is foundational, that is the root metaphor in all of scientific thinking, and that is the metaphor of machine. So science as we know it came into being roughly in the 17th, 18th century. These are debatable things. But it came into being at a time in which machines were being invented, right? A lot of machines were invented. And when you think of a machine, the kind of iconic instance of a machine is something like a train or like a locomotive, like a steam train or things like that, right? Machines are paradigmatically the things that work by push and pull, right? The mechanisms of gravity and gears that push and pull on each other, right? The kinds of machines we have now, they use electricity and so on, are significantly more sophisticated. They use different kinds of physical facts to ground its functioning. But Roos points out, those are just extended metaphors of the root way of thinking of machines as in the pulling, the mechanisms of pushing and pulling. And I give you this example of a fish that has that kind of mechanism, right? It's a machine that has wheels and it has, things that are pushing and pulling to make it work. And of course, that's not how fish look, right? That is not a fish. However, here's what Bruce thinks. To be a scientist is to use the metaphor of machine and to project it onto, to bring it into trying to understand the organisms that are things like fish. To understand the organism, which is not a machine, we project onto, we bring to the table the metaphor of machine and do like what this picture is doing. We pretend as though, we act as though our organisms are machines. And then when with the metaphor of a machine, we start asking questions about its functioning, its mechanisms. How does it work? And to have a science that is successful just is to have a scientific theory that adequately tells us how it works, how to build it, how to take it apart, how to fix it. So it's about how to do things in such a way that we can understand the working and can fix the working of the things that we're talking about. In this case, an organism that is a fish. But it's crucial for Bruce's purposes that we're not actually like describing the way the fish really is. That's not the point. The point is not to do that, to describe the way the fish is. The point is to bring forth a familiar metaphor like machine in order for us to be able to manipulate and comprehend how it works, or comprehend might not be the right word, but in order for us to get a better handle on how the fish works, to fix it, to change it, and so on. But it is our engagement with the function of the fish through the idea of the root metaphor of a machine that grounds our scientific inquiry. And here's the basic picture for all of science, thinks Bruce. To be a scientist is to think of the universe and everything it contains as a machine, like this locomotive, this train. To be a scientist is to, work as though, think as though, engage with a reality as though it were a machine. To take the metaphor of machine and extend it to everything else. Bruce points out that the history of the development of science begins with a lot of theists, people that thought that God created the world, and the scientific inquiry was a way of trying to figure out the thing that was created by God, the creation, and typically as a way, in a way that reflects the work of the creator. So the way that the historical origin of science has the history, has the trajectory. God is the creator of the machine. He's the one to build the locomotive. But, points out Bruce, at some point, and we don't exactly understand why, at some point God became the retired engineer. He engineered the machine, but it is not a proper scientific question to ask things about the engineer. To ask things about the engineer is to do something else. It's not to do science. To do science is to ask things about the inner working of the machine that is the world. So one of the things that scientists have done in the development of science, by removing the God as the creator, the engineer, scientists have removed the questions about the purposes. So think of this locomotive, the picture I have here again. Here's a question you may ask. How does it convert water and steam into forward motion? That's a real question about this machine, and then you can do experiments and they can do science to figure that out, the mechanism, the mechanics of using something to convert it into forward motion. But here's a different question you may ask. Where is it going? Where's the destination of this train? Why was it built? What's the point of having this machine? And here's Bruce's main observation. Those points, those questions cannot be settled by looking at the inner working of the machine. You cannot tell where it's going, why was it built, and so on, by just looking at the inner mechanisms. That's just not the method of going about figuring out the answer to those questions. But science is the process of trying to figure out the inner working mechanisms of the machine. So asking for the purposes of the machine is beyond the reach of scientific inquiry, because it goes beyond the proper bounds of the root metaphor of the universe as a machine. So scientists have to forego asking those questions. as far as they're scientists. So, and he labels that naturalism. Here's what Roos thinks. By naturalism here, I mean going only with nature. That is, understanding only in terms of unbroken laws without any interventions from outside of nature. That is to say, without any supernatural phenomena intervening. Do not, if you want to be a scientist, claims Roos, do not look at how the machine was built, the purpose for the machine, how someone outside the machine may interact with it. Just look at the inner workings of the machine. That is the proper scientific inquiry. And here's how Roos wants to put it. In an important sense, this is simply a methodological principle. For the purposes of doing science, you are, if you like, an atheist. So it's not that science gives you atheism, but rather that claims Roos, for one to do science properly, one must ignore and not ask some particular kinds of questions about the maker of the machine, of the point of the machine, the purpose of the machine. To do that is to no longer be doing science, to be doing something else like theology. So theologians are not scientists, scientists are not theologians. I mean, like one person can be both, but they're not doing the same kinds of things. So if you want to be a scientist, claims Roos, there is this kind of methodological principle of assuming no God intervention in your inquiries, in your experimentations. Okay, let's stop here. We'll pick up talking about Roos next time.